On today's show, I'm joined by the great Howard Beck to talk about the Mavericks, the view from the outside. What are people saying about the Dallas Mavericks? Can Nico and Jason Kidd right the ship? We'll talk about that and more on today's Locked On Mavs.
I'm Luka Doncic, and this is Locked On Mavericks.
Mavericks, NBA champions. Bang! It's good, and the Mavericks have won the game.
If you don't believe, you shouldn't be here.
Loyalty never fades away.
And welcome. You are locked on to the Dallas Mavericks. My name is Nick Angstadt, media member and NBA channel manager for the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Thanks for being part of the show and making Locked On Mavs your first listen each and every day. We are free and available on all podcast platforms, including YouTube. But the best way you can help us grow the show is to listen every day and to comment anything below. Let us know, do you believe that Jason Kidd and Nico Harrison can right the ship for the Dallas Mavericks next season? Curious what you guys think about that. If you want to support the show, text us, get text alerts from us, and participate in tomorrow's mailbag. Join our subtext where you can text us. There's a link in the description below, and then you can subscribe to that. Send us a question, and we'll hopefully answer it on tomorrow's show. Joining me today, it is my pleasure to introduce Howard Beck, former Bleacher Report, Sports Illustrated, everywhere that's good. He's been and covering the NBA for a very long time. What up, Beck?
What's happening? Thanks for having me in again. Appreciate it. Looking forward to this. I hope it's not too grisly of a listen for Mavs fans. I love the intro, by the way, with Luka giving the nice shout out / kind of implied endorsement to the pod. That's
for
great.
You and for those that don't know about that. We got that Luka's rookie year. Isaac Harris was there at Media Day and just ran into him in the hallway unsupervised. Like usually at Media Day, there's like a PR person holding the player's hand, like almost literally holding a player's hand, walking them to different stations. And he was unsupervised. And Isaac goes, "Luka, can you record this real quick?" And he just like he had it ready, put the phone in his face and had him record it real quick. And we've used it ever since. And so that's young rookie Luka.
I was going to say, young rookie with still kind of stronger accent, Luka, right? Like if he recorded that again now, I think it would sound a little bit different. He's been in the U.S. for a few more years, and
it would sound like him pushing the phone out of Isaac's hand is what it would sound like.
Well, there's also that possibility that now he knows better to just like tell everybody like, sorry, I got other things to do.
Today, I'm curious to talk to Howard Beck about Luka Doncic bouncing back. Did he have him for first team All-NBA, things like that. I'm curious what he thought about Luka's season. And then we'll start with just the perspective of the Dallas Mavericks, of Luka and Kyrie. We'll talk about Jason Kidd and Nico Harrison. So let's start there. From your perspective, can the Mavericks make Luka and Kyrie work? Like, what didn't work about that to you? Can they make it work going forward? Are you optimistic, pessimistic about it? What are your thoughts about them two?
It's such a difficult thing, right? Because you have this incredibly small sample size. The results in just the top line, the wins and losses, were so ghastly that it's hard not to think immediately, well, okay, it failed. This was a failure. And on the most basic level, I would say that it was a failure. So before we get to can it actually work and is are we being too hasty in judging it? I would just say this. If the goal of a blockbuster midseason trade was to elevate your team and instead sent you the other direction, then the trade was obviously a failure. And more than that, in my memory, and my memory sometimes fails me after all these years, but I've been covering the league for 26 years. I can't think of a midseason trade, an in-season trade, that was as catastrophic as this one. I think it's the most catastrophic results of an in-season trade that I can recall. And I say that kind of carving out some space for things like the Nets had no choice but to trade Kyrie Irving and Kevin Durant, right? Like, they could have said no, I suppose.
They still made the playoffs.
and yes, and the Nets still made the playoffs. The Nets finished off better than the Mavericks did. So I'm discounting like someone has a trade demand or something else has happened that has put a team in a position. For a team that was in the Mavericks position, where you are already a high-level playoff team or a mid-tier playoff team coming off of Western Conference Finals and making a blockbuster in-season deal to elevate you, and instead you plummet, it's a failure, period. It doesn't mean it can't work with time and other moves behind it, but you have to accept, first of all, that there is something alarming that happened. So to that, obviously a lot of this was who you lost, Dorian Finney-Smith chiefly, but also just in general, when you're trading 2 starters for 1 starter and you already didn't have great depth, you're going to put yourself at a deficit. They already were at a deficit in terms of size and defense. Didn't help them there. You already had, and then the fundamentals of the trade itself. Did you really need to go get a Kyrie Irving specifically? You've got Luka Doncic, one of the greatest scorer, playmaker, high usage players we've seen in the last decade. And I think there was a valid question going into this deal as to whether or not getting another high usage scorer playmaker was the right move. He's the guy who was available, Kyrie. But if Kyrie never asks out from the Nets, demands out, do the Mavericks just stand pat with who they had? Are they better off these last couple of months if Kyrie Irving had never become available? Would they have made a different deal? Was there another deal to be made? I don't know. Those are a lot of hypotheticals. And I would say, like, I don't, you have to be opportunistic in this league, and you can only go and trade for the guys who are actually available to be traded for. That's a given. But it doesn't mean you have to trade for the guy who becomes available when he does. Kyrie Irving obviously came with a lot of concerns and a very messy history. I understand that he has been a model citizen in Dallas by all accounts. I understand that the statistics were spectacular. Kyrie's very good at putting up great statistics. No one's ever questioned whether he had talent or the ability to be a highly efficient scorer. Whether he was the best complement to Luka, I think, is still an open question. And whether you can afford to have those two together, given what it does to you defensively, also do what it does to your payroll. You have a lot invested in 2 guys who differently do a lot of the same things. So how are you filling out the rest of that lineup and rotation? And so, at this point, look, I would ask the question back to anybody who says, well, obviously they're going to re-sign Kyrie. Obviously they have to re-sign Kyrie. The question I would ask back is, what's the case for keeping him? And I guess that case probably is, well, he's super talented. You have his bird rights, and there's a sunk cost of the stuff you sent out. And so you might as well keep him because you made an investment. The cap room may not get you anybody better if you decide not to re-sign him. Okay, those are all fair. I'm still not wholly convinced that he is their best path forward. But I'm going to take it as a given for this purposes of this discussion. I'm going to take it as a given that they're going to re-sign him. There's not a great market for him beyond Dallas. They kind of need him, and he kind of needs them.
That's where they are now. I mean, you have to. I mean, we said that after Brunson was a free agent, said you have to re-sign him at whatever cost, and then they didn't do that. So maybe they won't, and we'll be surprised. But I think at this point they have to. And I know that the thinking of the Mavericks at the time of doing the trade, and even before that, when they went to the Western Conference Finals, even then they knew, like, okay, we're not a match for this Warriors team, for a team like this with this kind of depth, with this kind of defense that they can play. For our offense that had kind of struggled that year, but had worked under Luka and Jalen Brunson, we need that second star. We need somebody that can carry a load when Luka's off the court. We need somebody that can do incredible things and like go on a 26-point run like they did this year in the fourth quarter against the Timberwolves in a game where you're down 20 and all of a sudden a star player comes in and like carries. And so they knew they wanted a player like that and knew that they needed another star next to Luka. They didn't see Brunson being that guy. And so then they decided to go and get Kyrie because, like you said, he's the one that was available. Is that flawed thinking in today's NBA? Can you just win with, like, look at what Kawhi's doing right now with just like a bunch of dudes around him and one guy that can make it happen? It seems like we're a long way away from, you got to get 3 guys. You got to get 3 guys together. It seems like those always fail because if one of those guys goes down, then you're down to just 2 guys and nothing else, or 1 guy if you're Kevin Durant in the Nets at some point.
I have made this same case in recent years as we've kind of transitioned out of the super team era that was kicked off. We think about it as kicked off by LeBron, Wade, Bosh, but really was kicked off by the Celtics getting Ray Allen and Kevin Garnett to go with Paul Pierce, right?
Yeah.
So there's the beginning of the modern super team era in 2008 when they win the championship. LeBron crushed by the Celtics, frustrated by the Celtics, goes to Miami, and then we have this arms race, and everyone's trying to assemble a big 3. And in the Warriors' case, they eventually had a big 4. That era is kind of, if it's not over, it's on pause. We're in a transitional phase, something. But the Warriors won the championship last year with Steph playing at an MVP level, Klay Thompson no longer an all-star, Draymond Green flirting with edges of all-star, status. Andrew Wiggins, a one-time all-star, right? That was not by any stretch a super team. Before them, the Bucks win the championship with Giannis, and hey, well, Chris Middleton, Drew Holiday, sure, they've been an all-star now and then, but not a super team. This is not that same model. It is one supreme player, an elite MVP caliber player, usually a scorer, playmaker type, high usage guy, surrounded by perfectly fitting pieces and some guys who might be all-star in a given year. So that was the model the Warriors won with last year, the model the Bucks won with the year before, the model that the Raptors won with when they beat the Warriors in 2019.
Yeah.
Kawhi and a bunch of really good players. So there's a version there where I think Luka plus a really well-calibrated supporting cast with a lot of shooting and length and defense could probably go a really long way. But I understand, like in the NBA, talent dictates a lot. And if you have one star, your goal is always to get the second star. And if you've got two, you're going to try to get a third. That's just the way it goes. And I get that. I did have a discussion with somebody back in it's probably mid to late January as we were approaching the trade deadline, and you're having conversations with people around the league about what teams might do. And I had a conversation with one person in particular, a front office member from another team, asking them, so what do you think the Dallas Mavericks are going to do? Luka's got he needs a second star, blah, blah, blah. And the immediate response from this person was, are you sure that's what Luka wants? And there was skepticism around the league about whether Luka truly would want to welcome in another high usage, scorer, another superstar. Fair or unfair, that was a perception by other folks around the league. And, it's a delicate thing. You need a second star most of the time, right? Even though there is this new template essentially with one superstar calibrated around him, you often need a second star to alleviate some of the burden, to alleviate some of the workload, to not burn your guy out. There are other reasons to do it other than just, in the abstract, this is how you win. You don't want Luka to feel like you've left me on an island. And so then it's just a matter of getting the right complementary star. I don't know if Kyrie is that guy. He's the guy who was available, but I'm still not sure if he was the right guy.
Coming up, he may not be the right guy, but let's talk about if Jason Kidd and Nico Harrison are the right guys to right the ship for the Dallas Mavericks. I'll ask Howard that coming up. But before we do, let me tell you about eBay Motors. For a championship team, it's all about making sure, just like we were just talking about, that every player is the right fit. It's the same when it comes to your vehicle. Every part needs to fit just right. So the next time you need parts and accessories, head to eBay Motors. With eBay Guaranteed Fit, you can be sure that every part you need is the right fit or your money back. Go to see what is available for you. Add your ride to My Garage. You can look for the green check to know if your part will fit, because just like in sports, confidence is the name of the game when you shop eBay Motors. With over 122 million parts to choose from, you'll be back in the game in no time. After all, it's easy to bring home a win when the right parts are guaranteed. Get the right parts, the right fit, and the right prices on ebaymotors.com. Let's ride, and eligible items only. Exclusions apply. All right, Howard, thanks everybody for hanging out with us on the Locked On Mavs and joining us. We're 5 days a week, all through the offseason. People will continue to ask us what we talk about all offseason, and we'll do an episode yesterday, like what if the Mavs get the number one pick? So you can go check out that episode. Or tomorrow we'll do a mailbag with our subtext subscribers. Send a question, and we'll hopefully answer them in that episode tomorrow. We were talking about Luka and Kyrie, if they're the right fit. There's a lot of talk about Jason Kidd and about Nico Harrison this season. It's year 2 for both of them in control of the Mavericks, part of the brain trust that runs the Mavericks, with Mark Cuban as sometimes the head of the snake, sometimes the behind pushing the car that's not working, like whatever you think, sometimes in the shadow GM, like depends on what you think Mark Cuban is. What's your outside perspective of the job that Jason Kidd has done and the job that Nico Harrison have done over the last 2 years?
So on the Mark Cuban part of it, if I'm remembering correctly, I think it was maybe 8 or 9 years ago, maybe even 10 years ago at this point. I think because the executive of the year is voted on by the other executives, and I think they just write in a name. If I recall correctly, there was a year where at least one person wrote down Mark Cuban, and this was by the other executives. So if that doesn't tell you how the league perceives the hierarchy or who's actually making basketball decisions, anyway, just thought I'd throw that out there.
Yeah, it's a Jerry Jones situation we're dealing with again over here in Dallas. It's just 2 of those.
So yeah, which maybe not ideal. Maybe not. So I'll address Kidd first. So, obviously I'm based in Brooklyn. I saw Kidd make his coaching debut here with the Nets. A little bit rocky. He went to Milwaukee, started to figure some things out, but a little rocky.
Were you there for when he had the cup in his hand and got it spilled on the sideline?
I was. That was a moment, to be sure. He gets criticized for that. I admire the creativity. The comic value of it is outstanding.
Oh yeah.
So whether it's like a great coaching move or not, or whether you think it's like it should be beneath him or what, I don't even care. I just love that he did it. But it's been a mixed bag for him as a coach. And when they hired Jason Kidd, it wasn't even Nico who hired him, right? Cuban hired Nico and Jason Kidd, I think, in like 1-2
package
punch. Deal. Yeah. And at that point in time, I don't want to say no one else would have hired Kidd, but I don't think there were too many advocates for Kidd around the league. Cuban, like a lot of owners in this league, gravitates toward people he knows and trusts and likes. Sometimes that works out and sometimes it doesn't. It has, there are plenty of examples of where it hasn't. I don't need to go down that rabbit hole, but there are plenty of examples where just hiring the people that you know and trust and like does not necessarily get you the best results. I don't think that the Mavericks problem, I know that Mavericks fans have been clamoring about, Jason Kidd's role in all this for the last several months. It's very rarely a coaching issue in this league. If your team is falling apart at the seams, things are going badly, it's almost always personnel first. It's very rare that you have great personnel and the coach just screwed the whole thing up. I'm sorry, the Mavericks do not have a great roster, and they weaken themselves with the trade for Kyrie overall. That's evident. That is obvious. Could Jason Kidd have done better with what he had? Maybe, but how much better? Marginally. It still comes down to talent, and talent leads to the front office, and in this case, ownership as well. So if you're doing the blame power rankings, Jason Kidd's not high on the list for me. I very rarely feel like the coach is the reason a team fell short of expectations. So I'm looking at the front office first. It's telling that my good friend Mark Stein reported this week that Dennis Lindsey is going to be hired as a special assistant. Dennis Lindsey, very accomplished executive in this league with Utah and previously Houston, San Antonio. And so it's telling that they're hiring him. Like that tells you something.
Yep.
They know they need an experienced hand. I have nothing, no specific critique of Nico Harrison, but like a lot of other hires in recent years, the Knicks with Leon Rose and some others, you're hiring a guy who has been in basketball circles and knows the game, but has not been a GM or been in a front office before. And there's a learning curve. Thus, you're hiring Dennis Lindsey now to kind of help out with maybe filling some of the gaps. But the early returns, like I was just kind of going through before we got on, like, all right, so Nico's first draft, they don't have a first round pick. Second draft, still don't have a first round pick. They they get Jaden Hardy in the second round. He's got some promise. Traded Porzingis for Dinwiddie and Bertans, and then flipped Dinwiddie eventually for Kyrie, along with obviously Finney-Smith. None of this has been great. They're still stuck with Bertans for a couple of years and a lot of money. The Kyrie deal, jury's sort of still out, and now they've got to decide whether to re-sign him to a big, potentially long deal that will come with considerable risk. Traded for Christian Wood, probably letting him walk as a free agent. Signed JaVale McGee, fell out of the rotation. They got fined for tanking. That's kind of a thing. And again, that's organizational, right? Like that's not. So there are times when you can't separate Nico from Cuban on this stuff. That's everybody. But I there's nothing so far to point to and say, wow, Nico Harrison's really shown he can do this job at a high level. And there's nothing I would point to yet and say that he can't. But, you get a couple of off seasons to try to remake a team and put your imprint on it. And, so far we don't, there's not enough of a positive result to say that like he's been the right guy for this. This is I would just say this is obviously a huge offseason for the Mavericks, period. And we'll get into Luka's future, I'm sure. But also this is a huge offseason for this front office. there's a lot they got to fix. And do they have the tools to do it? Can they pull it off? It's going to be a fascinating offseason for them.
Coming up, I'm curious about the athletic player poll recently that asked about which coach you'd least like to play for and most like to play for, and Jason Kidd's status on that. We'll talk about that coming up. All right, Howard, thanks everybody for joining us on Locked On Mavs, hanging out with us. We're talking about Jason Kidd and Nico Harrison. We talked about the job Nico Harrison has done. I'm curious about Jason Kidd and the perception of Jason Kidd, because The Athletic did an anonymous player poll where they polled like 100 players or something, let them be anonymous, and had them just vote on a bunch of different things. And I thought it was very interesting. And one of the things that I thought was the most interesting, at least to Mavs fans into this, was coach that you'd most like to play for and the coach that you'd least like to play for. Because when the Mavericks brought in, like we mentioned before, Nico and Jason Kidd as a package deal, they wanted to do the opposite of what they just had. They had Rick Carlisle, they had Donnie Nelson, two figures that Rick Carlisle, great coach. Players didn't want to play for Rick Carlisle. And with Donnie Nelson, didn't really have that connection with players nearly in the same way that Nico Harrison does, having been the Nike guy and been guys reps and having the relationships that he had. They kind of went like the complete opposite direction of that. And they brought in Jason Kidd because Damian Lillard had talked about wanting to play for Jason Kidd. LeBron James had talked about wanting to play for Jason Kidd. The Lakers almost hired Jason Kidd, but didn't want the PR look of it. We've talked to the Cam brothers about that a bunch on this show. But with Jason Kidd on this poll, 3 players out of the 100 or so that voted that they'd least like to play for Jason Kidd. Not a lot, but at least 3 out there voted that they would least, of all the coaches in the NBA, would least like to play for Jason Kidd. If you go to the other poll, which coach would you most want to play for? 0 votes for Jason Kidd. So I'm curious if the Mavericks bring in Jason Kidd to be, all right, he can be the star speaker. He can talk to Luka. He can bring in a star in a way Rick Carlisle couldn't. He can, make us be an attractive destination for other players. Is that done now? Like after this season, is that just done, or is that something that the Mavericks were never getting when they hired Jason Kidd?
I've said this many times over the years, often in regard to the other team in my backyard, the Knicks. The Knicks are constantly hiring GMs and coaches who they think are going to somehow be the magnet to draw the stars. Again, they hired Leon Rose away from CAA because Leon Rose and World Wide West came as a package deal, and those are the guys who were getting all these players, and they know all the players, and they know superstars. We're going to get
it worked for Brunson.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, the Knicks have done okay the last couple of years. It's been kind of up and down, but it hasn't gotten them superstars. It hasn't gotten them like some great CAA clients. Like it doesn't work.
Just a godson.
Yeah. So like, I don't, mean for this to be like, Knicks catching strays time in the pod, but like I've watched a franchise try this over and over, and the Mavericks, I said this and I wrote this, I think, when they hired Nico and Jason Kidd. It looked to me like that's what they were trying to do, was like hire guys who had relationships. And sure, Jason Kidd commands the respect of every player, and certainly the stars in this league all have incredible regard for Jason. Like if you're not asking players about their perceptions of Jason Kidd as a coach and whether they want to play for him, but instead are just asking, what do you think of Jason Kidd? Players are going to be like overwhelmingly positive, like high regard for his basketball intellect and his accomplishments, everything else about him. As a coach, again, it's been a mixed bag, but having a coach who players like and respect is not the same as being able to sign those players. It doesn't work that way. And the same thing with the GM, whether it's Nico Harrison, whether it's Leon Rose, whether it's somebody else, hiring a guy who's just well networked. Players don't go to teams because they really love the GM or the coach. They go for some combination of
weather,
market size, contract, role, shots per game that may or may not be there, who their teammates are going to be, what their chances of winning at a high level are going to be. It's all these things, where their family might be the happiest, where they might be the most happy. It's all of these other things. I would be interested in this version of the poll if the Athletic ever decides to go down this road. It'd be really interesting to know how players break down all those factors I just mentioned, and where team ownership, team GM, team coach actually factor into it. And I'm not saying those things are irrelevant. Of course they're relevant. Of course you pay attention to which franchises are constantly bumbling and getting it wrong. You're paying attention to the volatility of a franchise, how often they're replacing their coach and GM. But no, no GM is getting a player because he's like this great networker, charismatic presence. It doesn't work that way. So, player perceptions of Jason Kidd notwithstanding, I just don't think that that's the approach you should take.
Let's talk about Luka Doncic now. Did you pick him for first team All-NBA? Would you have picked him for first team All-NBA? I'm curious your thoughts on his season and if he's deserving.
So I was a voter this year. I did put him on first team All-NBA with some hesitation. The first time I've really hesitated, right?
Yeah.
I did knock him off my MVP ballot entirely because of the way their season ended. I think my fourth and fifth were Tatum and Butler. I filed the ballot a week and a half ago. I've already forgotten half of it.
Well, it's fifth MVP. It's okay.
And listen, Luka was clearly, in that top 5 discussion for most of the season. And it's not all on him that the Mavericks flamed out as the way they did, but it's MVP. You have to factor in team success or lack thereof. So, but I have a different standard for MVP and All-NBA, and so not everybody agrees with this approach to it, but I've always had this division in my own head. MVP, the team success matters a lot more because it's MVP. You better be on a great team. And especially at the top of the ballot. All-NBA to me is more of an individual award where the wins and losses will factor in on some level because, hey, if you're putting up great stats and your team's not winning, then what's the point? Sure. But I'm not weighing it quite as heavily. It's more about individual excellence for All-NBA. So Luka survived my evaluation on that level. I thought about knocking him down to second team because of the way the Mavericks finished. The problem is he still had an outstanding season by almost any other measure. And so I had him and Donovan Mitchell on the first team. And it partially was because some of the other candidates for first team, I just couldn't quite get myself there. Like Steph Curry and Dame Lillard both had incredible individual seasons, but the Blazers were awful and the Warriors were weird, but that was my second team. And then my third team was De'Aaron Fox and Shai Gilgeous-Alexander, who, De'Aaron Fox's team did really well. His personal excellence wasn't quite at the level of Steph and Dame. Shai Gilgeous-Alexander, incredible season. Team, was what it was. It's hard. It's none of this is perfect. None of this is scientific. You're just kind of making your best judgment. But ultimately for me, those were my 6 guards. And I still thought that Luka, despite everything, probably was the most deserving of first team based on his individual play.
I'm curious what your thoughts are on this aspect. We've, for the first time this season, heard and seen Luka frustrated about his situation with the Mavericks, seen him visibly frustrated. We've heard the rumblings of, he could request a trade, in the future. He shot that down and said, hey, there's no reason to be worried. I like it here. I'm happy here. All that stuff, all the things that players are supposed to say. What can the Mavericks do to avoid what happened to other top stars? Because we don't see this very often in the NBA. It's a generational player. There's only a certain number of them in a generation. That's like the way that the word works.
Yes.
LeBron in Cleveland, KD in OKC. They both signed a second contract. They stayed a little bit through the second contract, and LeBron ended it, and KD ended up. He finished. Did he finish his second contract?
Yes.
Yeah, so they both finished their second contract and then left. What can the Mavericks do to avoid that situation?
Win. I mean, it's really that simple.
That's what Nico said.
But it is that simple. I mean, you don't want to be glib about it and you don't want to oversimplify, but I mean, the Cavaliers were winning at a high level in the regular season, right? That team was winning 60 plus games a season before LeBron left for Miami, but it was clear they were never getting the kind of stars he needed or even another star, period. They had tried everybody and there was no way forward. And he saw it and he knew nobody was coming to Cleveland. So he had to go to the other stars. He made a very pragmatic decision and he left. The Thunder had the stars, had to trade one of them for luxury tax purposes, James Harden. But there were other issues there. Durant and Westbrook clearly weren't functioning that well together on some level. Like they were winning games. Obviously they were in a conference finals where they had a 3-1 lead. But there were other issues there. Also, those are 2 small market teams, and Cleveland's case, a very cold weather city. Dallas is a major market, warmer weather. They don't have some of the other burdens that some of these teams that you're mentioning had, but it still comes down to, can you get the right talent around the guy so that you can win at a high level? And when Luka says in, that final press conference or the one before that, whenever it was, hey, look, don't worry, I'm not thinking about That's what he has to say. But I would say believe his body language and his tone more than the words. The rumor wasn't that he's going to ask out. The rumor was that the Mavericks were worried he was going to ask out. And that's a really important distinction. So Luka kind of played the straw man thing where he said, no, I don't know where this is coming from. I'm not asking. It's not what Tim McMahon.
I never said that.
Right. Not what Tim McMahon or anybody else reported. The report was the Mavericks are worried about it. By the way, they should be. Every team in that position should be. If you can't find the right combination around your young superstar who's still barely entering his prime, and he's been with you for a while and you're moving backwards instead of forwards, yes, at that point you should start to worry. And when his comportment, his demeanor, his tone have been what they were, you should be worried. And I'm not saying that to say that I think he's going to ask out, not by any stretch. I don't know what's in his head. He may not, but you absolutely have to worry about it. You are always on the clock in this league when you have a player of that caliber, and the Mavericks know that. So, the answer is as simple as it gets, and yet as complicated as it gets. Find better supporting players around him and win. That's as basic as it gets.
It really just comes down to that, and everything else should work out. That's what Nico Harrison said. And so this summer, we'll see what happens. We'll cover them throughout all the offseason. Tomorrow, we'll be back with a subtext mailbag, so subscribe to our subtext. You can subscribe for just a trial. If you want to just submit one mailbag question, you can do that. We'd love to have you stick around for a little bit longer. Thanks, Howard Beck, for joining us. You can check out Howard on Locked On NBA on Mondays with some other host. I don't know whoever that is. And then he's all throughout the network, too. You were on Blazers the other day. You'll be on Celtics today, all throughout on different shows, so we appreciate you. Guys, thanks so much for listening to Locked On Mavs. Peace out. Boom.